Statement, then ask some questions. In my career, I've had the opportunity to work with pharma, financial services, manufacturing, and more recently, a high-tech engineering company that was involved in mergers and acquisitions. And I would not say that it is a core part of the consulting practice that I've been a part of over the years. I would say, though, that having been a part of the C-suites as a consultant with these various organizations, that it's quite something to see mergers and acquisitions up close. And maybe you feel you've been in the middle of this too in your consulting activities. And so I'm curious at the moment, and you can just raise your hand and I can see on our Hollywood squares, at the moment, how many of you are actively involved in assisting companies with mergers and acquisitions? So we have 4 folks who are busily doing that. So you are likely to recognize some of what I'm going to share because it's up close and personal to you. And then there are things I'm going to share that have to do with the ongoing effort to collect evidence about what makes for best practices that should be employed whenever an organization is involved with mergers and acquisitions. I think all of you know, based on any basic search that you may have done on mergers and acquisitions, that the majority of them do not achieve the financial expectations that drove at least some of the initial motive for the acquisition or the merger. And it's quite fascinating as all of you have had a parallel experience to what I'm about to describe. You can say to your client, here's what we know is best practice. And then they proceed to ignore you. Mm-hmm. I had to laugh when I read an article where Kahneman said that in 2000, I think it was 2017, he was going to stop consulting with organizations about cognitive biases because he had discovered it didn't matter how thorough and or how much he covered alerting management teams to cognitive biases and what they could do about it. They proceeded to ignore him anyway. So if they're going to ignore a Nobel Prize thinker, then who am I to expect that they're going to pay attention to me? Nonetheless, like Don Quixote, I continue to go after the windmills, thinking that hopefully I'll catch one of them one of these days and be able to get them convinced that actually there is a better way to do this to help lead you to greater opportunities for the success that you're seeking. Now, having said that, I have been a part of some successful acquisitions that is quite thrilling to watch how it unfolds, and in fact, the ways in which using best practice leads to the financial returns and the sort of overall benefits of a merger or acquisition that organizations expect. And thinking about today, I went looking again for what is some of the newest research pieces that people pulled together, or articles that have been written in business journals and magazines about mergers and acquisitions. And I, like you, if you've done some of that, would say to yourself, not much has changed in terms of the reasons why organizations tend to want to seek a merger or acquisition, and then, of course, reasons why they don't succeed. I was intrigued, though. The Financial Times, about 5 months ago, read an article on the elevated number of acquisitions, mergers and acquisitions during COVID, and the number of organizations that their primary motive for the merger or acquisition was to acquire talent. Now, in all of my years of looking at this particular topic, the acquiring a company for talent wasn't at the top of the list. But I would say, as I read the article, they convinced me that all around the world, an enormous volume of mergers and acquisitions are occurring because the acquiring company determined that their sustainability was tied to accessing the talent that would be essential for them as they move forward in a VUCA environment. So it's been interesting to watch how COVID seems to have accelerated the interest in mergers and acquisitions, and we can explain that and analyze that in a variety of ways. But none of it has changed the realities of what leads to more likelihood of success. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share some thoughts with you through a presentation, a very brief presentation. I have questions that were presented, most of which I'll simply have to respond to in a separate document. We just don't have time today to deal with some of the really profound issues that were presented. So if you will, I'm going to share and get LM to confirm with a thumbs up that the screen is showing as it should. And I want to make a couple of introductory observations and then restate some things that I think are important to keep in mind. Now, all of you know Bob, have heard Bob many, many times. And when Bob and I decided now 5 years ago to create, first it was TalentTelligent, and now we have changed the name to TalentTelligent. We really took up the question of what do we know now at this point in our careers that we believe will make the biggest difference in helping the next generation lead, nurture, acquire the talent necessary for success. And it naturally led to a variety of key questions, one of which, when we start looking at business activity, is how do we help organizations understand what's necessary for mergers and acquisitions. Now, some of you, I believe, know that we have a placemat that will make all kinds of linkages, and I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit. But the intent of the placemat is to provide for you a map of what are the key, if you will, steps and aspects of mergers and acquisitions, and how do our libraries from the leader's perspective and the manager's perspective intersect with those primary responsibilities. Now, I'm going to say a little bit more about what we know about the failure of M&A. And of course, at the end of the day, the failure is all tied to, in my view, human behavior. And if it's tied to human behavior, then there are things where we, as given our expertise, can help organizations manage M&A in a more effective way, because at the end of the day, it comes down to the kinds of behaviors that leaders and managers engage in to enable M&A to be successful. There are particular practices and various stages and phases which we think are pretty robust. In other words, this isn't just armchair. When Bob and I dug into the research on these issues, we kept coming up with similar insights about the phases and stages necessary for M&A to be successful. And then, of course, as I said, the placemat gives us a good look at the kinds of practices that make the biggest difference. Now, I'm not going to read this to you, and I don't expect you to read it. I just want you to know, I got your questions, those of you who sent in questions. Some of these I'll be able to respond to in our talk or chat today, but the rest of them I'll just have to give additional comments to. And LM will keep the list of all of you who are here so that I am able to send that out to you. I was intrigued by the last question, which was what my experience is in retaining the founder. And one could immediately think, well, the founder of the acquired organization. And I would tell you that 50% of the time, I've seen the founder and or CEO of either the acquired organization or the one doing the acquiring go out the door. And that's kind of interesting because we expect that the acquired company is going to lose some of its leadership, but I would say 50% of the time that's not been the case. Now, the founder issue is a particularly interesting one. Most organizations, when they are acquiring a company where the founder is still central to the company or organization, I've discovered that the deal is usually no more than 3 years. In other words, they want the founder there for 3 years to help with the integration of the two cultures. And again, almost always, the acquiring company fails to outline to the founder what their expectations are and how to use that, if you will, goodwill that the founder has with the company that's been acquired to the benefit of the acquisition. And I have found this quite fascinating. In one particular situation that I worked with several years ago, I kept saying to the chairman of the board of this particular organization that this founder, who is quite open to being active and helping the integration occur, is a person, because I had worked with him too, is a person that needs to know what the expectations are. Otherwise, he will spend his afternoons playing golf. He'll show up in the mornings and say hello to everybody and make people feel good, and then he'll be out of there because he doesn't want to be in the way. And of course, that led to a host of challenges and problems because people interpreted the founder's behavior as sort of disingenuous and not particularly committed to the transition that was underway. So that's an interesting question. And as I've thought about it, I think, if you have a founder around who's open to it, and even you tie some extra benefits to that founder being present during the integration phase, which is in many ways the most important for an acquisition to be successful, that would be a good thing to do. Anyway, I pulled out 2 documents that I thought folks might find interesting. One, a particular piece on merging cultures, again, because I think the culture question and integration questions are among the most complex, and I thought it'd be an interesting piece to sort of prompt your thinking. Also, I wanted the introduction to the mergers and acquisition book to be in front of you simply for 2 reasons. One, the intro does a nice summary of how disjointed really the research is on this particular phenomenon and the kind of things we're finding out and what's central to M&A being successful. Then, of course, the bibliography, which shows you that there's a lot of interest and has been a lot of interest in this question. And I guess we could say with the management being consistently faulty and making these efforts, it opens up opportunities for us to have plenty of work to do, which is one of the ways we might think about M&A. So you can, in the chat panel, if you want, to think about the mergers and acquisitions that you have observed and or heard of that have been successful. It would be interesting if you just jot in the chat space what your perspective is on this question. And I have my chat space open so I can see what you say. Interesting. Yeah. 40%. Yeah. Negative 30. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Well, look, we see the numbers are low, 30% thereabouts. And that's pretty consistent with what we've seen in the research. And when we ask the question, why are they typically not successful? Here are some of the answers we've gotten in the past. And I was most interested in what some of the reasons for failure that are identified in the most recent research. And that it won't surprise you that here in a February article that was in Harvard Business Review of last year, mixed motivations for the merger or acquisition, unrealistic expectations, hidden financial instabilities or inaccurate financial analysis, lack of communication throughout the process, or representation of the key stakeholders in the process, and of course, the cultural integration challenges, the inadequate attention to the cultural integration that has to happen if you're going to get to the overall objectives for the merger or acquisition. This particular piece, again, is a restatement. And what I like about this is that it's often what's thought of as the kind of what we would see as key leadership and behaviors, which are often thought of as subtle or soft factors, that are central to whether or not the merger or acquisition is successful. This is a 2002 article in Business Week. It says pretty much what I just read from the most recent piece of research. I find it interesting when I think about the ones I've been a part of. The financial analytical piece wasn't much such of the problem for why it failed. In almost every case, it was the failure to pay attention to what I would call the leadership equations involved in the transformation of one company in acquiring another. And so often the over attention to the accountant's analysis and the financial portfolio in terms of amount of attention and energy paid, and so little attention to, well, do we have the right people in the right jobs helping us through this process? And the ones where I would say I've been a part of that were successful, the CEO was cognizant that this was going to be a delicate process and needed to be attended to, and set aside 3 years of his attention and resources and budget to facilitate the kind of cultural integration necessary. And that company, the one I'm thinking about right now, the most recent merger and acquisition that I helped with, that company's sales portfolio, market portfolio is triple what it was. And they attribute it largely to the successful acquisition. So it does matter. And the pieces and the reason why I think some of the the behaviors or practices that we'll highlight here in a minute really matter is that they help us attend to the conflicts that are inherent in bringing two cultures together and the necessary kinds of leadership behaviors that are needed to make sure that as much integration and emergence of a new culture as possible can occur. I find it interesting that now 30 years well into lots of published material on organizational culture and organizational change, that so few people at the top take it as something they can do something about. I find it kind of interesting when we get into the conversation around culture. They all agree there is one. How to mold and manage that culture for some of them seems to be a great mystery. Now, you know that one of the things that Bob and I did when we decided to take a fresh look at what are the behaviors that matter in performance in organizations, and we said, okay, look, one of the big changes that we know that's occurred in research collected over the last 30 years is that the psychological demands of individual contributors and what's expected of them in their roles and their positions, and the demands of managers or supervisors, and of course, leaders at the top, are of such a distinctive nature that we really ought to ask the question, what do those people need in that context or that environment in order to be successful? And so when we accepted that as a reality and we started looking at the evidence, we said, well, there are very particular roles, regardless of what the organization is, that you must fulfill if you're at the top of the organization. Very specific roles if you're in the middle. And it is no accident that the managerial library has 11 roles because of the complexity of managerial management of, if you will, the big picture vision from the top and translating that into the activities of the teams of individual contributors. And then, of course, what we think may be one of the innovations that's been desperately needed in the field is how do we pay attention to individual contributors in an environment where individual contributors often these days aren't anticipating being in a company over the arc of a career, but in fact, we want them to be successful wherever they land. And what messages do they need to receive that to be successful as an individual contributor? What do you have to do? So the kinds of things that we identified for individual contributors created the library where there are 10 roles and 27 practices. And so the practices, as all of you know, support the roles. Well, of course, we started out with TalentTelligent because Bob and I were going to focus on teams. We were going to take our experience working on teams, and we created a company focused on teams, and it backed us right into, well, now wait just a minute. What cuts across all of these environments, psychological environments? And so we created the team library. And then, of course, as all of you know, Bob has had a long time interest in high potentials, and both of us have been engaged with those kinds of talent conversations and organizations. And we said, okay, let's tackle this one. And while we were at that process, we got a request about a merger. And we said, well, now here's some things about mergers that you need to pay attention to, which then led us to say, well, now hold on a minute. We've got these libraries of practices that we know matter to performance. How do these link up with the key phases and stages of mergers and acquisitions, which led us to what we are interested in primarily today. Now, again, if you looked at the placemat or you've looked at our material on this, we would say that these 10 activities are absolutely essential for M&A activity to be successful. And the kinds of folks who do one aren't necessarily the same folks who will do 3, 4, and 5. In other words, to be serious about this, we need to say, well, we know these 10 things have to be done. What are the practice sets, if you will, necessary to be highly effective in each of these? And that led us to doing the mapping that we've done that we will share with you. And in our placemat, we set out to define the 10 key activities and phases of mergers and acquisitions. And in that process, hopefully outline for everybody, here's what's in our point of view about each of these that we think is vital. Now, if you've seen the placemat, you know that we focused on CASAL and CASAM. We have gotten questions about CASI, and I would just say to you, and Bob and I have talked about this at some length, that the thing about CASI is that the kinds of activities in M&A that these folks are going to be doing is more often than not sort of an accelerated attention to some of the work that they may already do. It might not be as unique and distinctive in M&A as we know a leader's role and a manager's role might be. So when we did our analysis and we said, well, what do we think really is going to have the biggest impact in each of these phases? We did our mapping, and you see on the screen, our 5s are in red to say this particular practice is really going to be essential. You need to make sure that a person who's involved in this particular aspect of M&A has this particular practice well under her or his belt, if you're going to get the biggest return out of this whole entire process. Same thing with the managerial practices and how we map those to the key aspects of M&A and how those typically play out. Now, one of the things I would observe in M&A activities when I have worked with organizations, I can get a real clue as to how serious they are in paying attention to this being successful by how much talent they're willing to apply to the process. The minute they say to me, well, we've got this M&A team, and I look at it and it's all accountants. And I say, so tell me, how are these accountants going to formulate the communication that needs to happen? How are these accountants going to pay attention to the cultural factors that need to, and of course, they look at me with blank stares, and sort of like, Pearman, what planet did you come from? And I say to them, well, that's precisely the point. It is unreasonable to expect this financial team that's come up with the logic and the argument for this acquisition to also be the team to lead this to completion and success. And you can give them multiple reasons. And as I say, like Kahneman, I've thrown up my hands at times and said, you get the future you've chosen by not paying attention to the evidence that tells us what particular processes you need to engage when, and people who bring particular capabilities to the whole process itself. Now, no surprise here. that if you looked at and threaded the research, you would see that if we had a checklist, what do we want everybody to do? We want them to pay attention to the elements of due diligence, be very clear about leadership issues through the whole process. Who is going to be responsible for what throughout the entire process? And that is vital. Making sure that the attention is properly, really and truly, not just on growth and not just on synergy and integration, but that you're looking across to all of those issues for the long game. Early wins, knowing that you're going to be creating a new culture. It's not just simply that you're going to have one culture take over another, but the two coming together are going to emerge and create a new culture, really. And then, of course, we can't communicate enough and communicate priorities enough as we go forward. So anyway, again, here are the 10 roles. You see in red the ones that often, in my view anyway, get the most attention in some ways, or are the cause of the most trouble, if you will, in M&As and why they're successful or not. So if you look at our template, we've put both CASAL and CASAM on the same side, where we have coded to say at each of these opportunities of the 10 parts of M&A, here are the kinds of practices that are going to make the biggest difference. And you want to make sure you put the leadership in the right place at the right time. Almost never one person is going to be able to pull this off as the M&A, overall M&A leader, if you will. But we need multiple people with the right talent and skills at the right time in this process for it to be successful. So I'm going to stop all that now. And I'm interested in questions, reactions, your experiences. And I might address another item or two from some of those questions that were put out there earlier. So, Ulrich, let me start with you. Particular thoughts, questions, observations that you have in your M&A experience?
Yeah, you could say it's pre-signing, where we are mapping the target organization that we're going to acquire. What is the culture mapped towards our culture? So where will we have the biggest gap that we need to deal with in the integration afterwards, in the post-merger? And that we have tried to set up ourselves, build on some of the old Lominger work and Confrero work, saying, for example, we know in this organization that performance approach is a big thing. So what does that performance approach look like in the target organization? And how close are they to us, or how far away are they from us? And there we still need a bit more structure to do that. We took the old one, drive for result and so on, some of those, and tried to interview for that and get some evidence around that. If that makes sense.
Yeah, you've highlighted something that I think is really interesting, and very often here's what I've observed, and if all of you, if this is similar or different, feel free to say so. The acquiring company has this ridiculous idea, yes, I have a judgment on it, that we'll just impose our accounting methodologies and our HR processes and our IT processes on the acquiring company, because we've really done a great job of creating a superior IT, superior accounting methodologies and HR stuff. And of course, the acquiring company will naturally see the wisdom of how brilliant we are, and they'll just adopt it, and we'll all be happy campers. Well, As we all know, that's just not true. When you line up HR practices, for example, it starts giving you real clues about the cultural differences from one enterprise to the other. When you look at their IT methodologies and how they manage IT issues within each organization, there's often a Grand Canyon of difference between, and can even be in the equipment. I couldn't believe it one time when I had a CEO say, well, we'll just replace everybody's computer in the company we're buying with the computer that has our stuff already built in it. I said, so you somehow think that all of these people who've been on Apple in this very growing enterprise that you decided you wanted to buy are just going to naturally fall in love with a Dell laptop on their desktop, and the level of productivity is going to be the same. So it's interesting how the lacunas are for the acquiring organization, which then often in those three areas I mentioned seem to show up the fastest and are the sources of greatest conflict. And of course, one of the challenges, for example, that I have found with IT isn't just the financial merger, isn't just simply getting the financial reports and the ledgers and all that. Even if they've been using the same vendor, the way they've customized their reports and the way they've set up their databases can lead to unbelievable strife in trying to get those two systems to talk to each other in a way that leads to intelligible management. But if I can get them to pay attention to, well, let's look at the details of HR practices, how much is invested in development and what are the practices and activities that company A and company B have been doing, and how is that going to fit with the alignment of the acquiring company and the IT practices, as well as I said, the accounting practices. And of course, that just scratches the surface of core issues that need to be looked at very, very closely. I chuckle only because when you, and I'm sure all of you had this sort of situation, you're thinking to yourself, I know these are really, really bright people. And that they magically think that this acquisition is going to produce, and very often it feels that way to me, produce some sort of magical financial benefits without a hell of a lot of work. It just amazes me. And of course, if you're making decisions based on spreadsheets and not paying attention to the interpersonal components and dynamics in it, you obviously can fall into as I said, those lacunas. I find that if I can invite a discussion with the senior leadership about when they are serious about an acquisition, about how are we going to do this in the most successful way, and how are we going to elevate those who have the necessary KSAs to do this successfully. They are sometimes astonished that I'm saying to them, to do this right, you're going to have to involve a variety of people who are going to bring to this process the necessary focus at each stage. And if we're going to pay attention, especially to how we integrate the acquiring enterprise, it's actually going to require as much or more attention and capability than perhaps you invested in the upfront piece in analyzing and doing due diligence on the financial aspects of the acquisition that you want to make.
Mhm.
Um,
Roger, Dan has his hand up, and then there was a really interesting thread from Claire in the chat panel as well. So Dan, you want to jump in?
Yeah, you pretty much hit on it. So Claire's note about when we were showing the weightings of the leader responsibilities, the manager responsibilities, talking about the roles through the merger process, the acquisition process. Claire's question was, where's leading and managing change as a competency? Is your and Bob's interpretation that the role weighting is actually the process of leading and managing change, or is there a behavioral element there that is not weighted as heavily around that competency?
Yeah. If you start looking at the particular behaviors that we've associated with practices, you'll find that we put specific change behaviors, if you will, the kinds of things managers and leaders need to do for change to be successful. We embedded those in various practices. And part of it in our debates that we've had is that change and transition, and I'm going to use transition to mean the emotional aspect of change. I mean, the fact is, people go and do change management workshops and change management plans, and they get that change management piece and the stages and steps that have to happen. And there's almost no surprise there about what change management is to be. Where they screw up is the failure to pay attention to emotional transitions.
That was my point. Because where I've seen them go successfully is where we've trained all of our managers on the bridges work and the, making them understand the difference between change and transition. Like change is an event. You can see it. I mean, transition is very emotional. It's the human side.
Well, and to make it even more complicated, if we imagine the emotional process that happens in transitions, that dip and movement up in acceptance of the new state of affairs happens at the C-suite months before it happens down at the individual contributors level. And the folks at the upper part of the organization are going, we've made this change. Why is this such a problem? And they are forgetting that the cascade impact of this in terms of emotional energy and that's where we can be really beneficial to them to say, now, hold on a minute, just because we have communicated, everybody knows the plan, blah, 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 doesn't mean at our levels in the organization that they're at the same place emotionally in order of embracing this transition that this change that has occurred. So in our codings and the way we got at that, we said, well, what are the kinds of behaviors that make the biggest difference, for example, in helping with what I will call emotional transitions? And so you see things like in our Casal library, leading change and transitions gets a 5. You'll see that reading and understanding people gets a 5 multiple times. You'll see that the dealing with conflict gets a 5 multiple times in different parts of the processes. And there are a number of others that I would say are very much a part of how we enable people to properly lead and facilitate the transitions piece, which is so vital to the success of our merger or acquisition. And I would even go so far as to say any sort of major change that an organization may be going through, such as they decide to exit certain markets, and that's going to completely alter some of their internal organizational structure, requiring redeployment of individuals. The same thing applies. It's almost like an acquisition has occurred in a strange sort of way, the same kind of attention needs to be paid when those kinds of big decisions get made, especially when you have people who've been committed to an enterprise for a period of time. Paying attention to their emotional needs requires a little bit more focus. And one of the things that you've all seen that Bob and I have tried to do with our development material is pay attention to what the neuroscience is saying to us about what does it take for a person to focus appropriately on a particular practice and to be successful with that practice. And what we've tried to say is, look, what's been ignored for a long time is just how powerful what I'll call brain rules are. That's not Bob's phrasing of this. It's my phrasing of this, that there are some brain rules you just can't break. Emerson called it the iron rod through human experience. You simply cannot break how the brain's going to react when a person is experiencing, especially what they perceive as a threatening shift or change. And helping managers and leaders understand that, I think, is the reason why we included that whole section throughout our materials, and especially in some of the practices I just highlighted, to say to managers and leaders, look, you're dealing with some big issues here and big processes here, and these are the kinds of behaviors that will make the biggest difference, and the kind of point of view that will make the biggest difference as you're working through, at least in this case, we think of mergers and acquisitions. Other thoughts, questions, reactions?
Yes, please, Roger. Roger, what's your view on pace and size of change? Do you have a general recommendation there to make major changes up front and then work them through carefully, or to make them gradually, or let the organization sit for a while and do nothing?
Help me again with your framing there, Steve. Say a little bit more.
What I mean by that is when an acquiring organization comes in and there are major changes to be made, some will just let the organization sit and manage itself for a time. Others will make those changes up front and choose to make it a bit of an invitation for those who want to stay and adjust. And others do something in the middle. What's your recommendation? Make wholesale organizational change, or do it in piecemeal manner over time?
Well, and it won't surprise you when you hear me say it depends. It strikes me, and I've seen all of the above, as I'm sure many of you have. In general, I think those who have tried to make the wholesale change fast fail the fastest, in part because they haven't been willing to invest the necessary energies and necessary funds to foster and facilitate that change in a way that does show they are committed to the people in the acquiring organization. Those who try to make it rapidly tend to want to have a champagne outcome, and they haven't even put in a Pepsi budget to help make that occur. I have seen that work well in terms of companies that say, look, we feel like we do best when we're able to embrace the organization and take people and embrace them and do a whole variety of things to show that the new culture, the new way we're going to operate is going to be to everybody's mutual benefits. I have also seen the let them alone and let them be the best that they can be at. If you hired them, the motivation for hiring them was hiring them. To acquire them, it was to get the benefit of their marketplace and or their financial returns. Maybe the best strategy is to have them in the family, but don't feel like you need to convert them in some way to the acquiring company's culture. And I've seen that be a very successful model that says, look, you're so good at what you do, we don't really want to change you. We just simply want to have you as a part of the family, and we want to provide support where it's needed for you to be continually successful. I don't know that I have a recommendation other than to say it ought to be thought through, whichever choice is going to be made. What's the primary motivation for it? And how will we metric our measurement of the outcomes so that, in fact, everybody's expectations are met and fulfilled? It's an interesting question, what works best? And it comes back in my mind to what's the motivation for the acquisition?
Mhm.
What's the sort of investment the acquiring company is willing to make? One particular case, I said to the CEO of the acquiring company, I said, I think your best bet is to leave this company you're going to acquire alone and study it to find out why it is so blamed successful relative to other companies in its field. Their performance is just breathtaking. And that's the reason why you wanted to acquire them, is that you wanted to enjoy those financial benefits. There were two founders, are happy and ready to let it go and sell, but don't touch anything. Leave it alone. And see what's working and not working, and slowly find out what are the ways in which you can integrate your best practices into theirs. And he promptly ignored me and tried to impose their processes on the acquired organization. They lost 30% of their management team within 12 months and lost $122 million in revenue. So there are good reasons to choose a strategy as you suggested, Steve, and why it can have a financial outcome if they choose the wrong one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Waylon's got his hand raised as well.
Hey, Roger. So are you suggesting that, let's say for the 10 roles for the M&A team, that these folks have sort of the ideal practices sort of in place and they're sort of operating at a good level before then actually embarking on a deal? First question. And the second question is, the iron rod, do you see that shortening if the team can do it really well, and so then transition integration actually happens faster, even though, people still have to go through the change process or the transformation process?
I think the answer to your questions in both cases are yes. If you are going to be really serious about having a successful merger or acquisition, then if you think about it and you say, well, we know we've got 10 things we have to absolutely process-wise occur. Let's take a look at who do we have to apply at each part of this process, and let's get this team together. And all of us get on the same page, and then go about our business of this merger or acquisition, then yes. And around the emotional piece, if you have done a good job of making sure on your team, there are those who can do those fives, if you will, that I mentioned. They will be paying attention, and they will have instituted all kinds of what I think of as cues. What are some prompters and cues to pay attention to how things are going in the organization, so that if there's something we need to adjust or tweak as the acquisition is unfolding and the cultural development is being attended to, we can tweak as needed. Where I think one additional observation I would have is the failure. Companies are happy to do due diligence on all kinds of financial metrics. They don't put as much value in understanding what I would call the financial benefits of the leadership team of the company they're trying to acquire. They don't always ask themselves, well, wow, maybe the reason why this company is so successful that we're wanting to acquire is in fact because some of that management talent has helped build this company. They're committed to this company and these people, and let's make sure we know who those people are so we don't lose them. Mm-hmm. Now, if the Financial Times is right that of more recent motivation for acquiring companies has to do with getting talent, one would assume that there has been some effort at understanding what talent are we acquiring and what is it going to take to keep them. Because if you don't ask yourself that question, if you think you're just going to acquire them and they're going to stick with you, that I would say wrong answer. You need to find out if that talent is going to be vital to the success of the future. What are the assets that they have in terms of their management and leadership style? And what is it going to take to make sure we do not lose them? And it becomes especially acute if you happen to have some high potentials thrown in there. Mm-hmm. High potentials who are rather notoriously restless. They might find an acquisition an exciting piece of news. They might also find that this acquisition, they've done a little study on the acquiring company and they don't like what they see. And they have the kind of confidence that says, well, guess what? I'm going to go somewhere else because I don't need to deal with this crap. Again, being as attentive to the financial audits, if you will, as that you would need to apply in looking at the management leadership audit of the skills and capabilities that you're acquiring, I think is really important. Mm-hmm. And I know I'm about to run out of time based on what was allotted.
Yeah. Roger, in certifications, everybody's talking about that strategic effectiveness architect piece. And I think Ulrich's last question could be our capper here in terms of, were you thinking about the approach to map? And it's a little different in terms of its mapping back to CASAM and CASAL, but did you have a similar approach?
Unpack the question a little more for me.
I'll let Ulrich do that if he'd like to.
Yeah, I've just used in some integrations where we put the leaders from the acquiring business and the acquired business together, and then facilitated what is the future organizational capabilities of the business. And the way we used that was through the toolkit of the strategic effectiveness, because that kept everyone on the same level, and it was more future oriented and not discussing where we were coming from as much, but more what do we need going forward. Of course, linking to the strategy of the new organization or a new business. I was just wondering if there's something similar approach that we could use here.
Well, I think we would argue, the simple answer is yes. And we would argue that if we're going to do this smartly, we would have already spent some time thinking about the culture of the future needed in the new enterprise. I mean, after all, if this acquisition is going to meet expectations, we do need to give the kind of strategic attention to what that new culture needs to be and what is it going to take for us to mold that culture under the new conditions that we have that have come as a result of the acquiring of Company B, when Company A has decided that they need either the product or the market, the talent that they're going for. So I appreciate the fact that there's such interest in this, and it would be fascinating for us to continue to explore what are ways we can make those mergers and acquisition supplemental materials useful for you. Bob and I are always interested in, well, what's a piece that we need to pay attention to that will make your life easier as a consultant, and actually a big help for organizations who are trying to manage these processes well. So we're always open to, hey, it'd be helpful if, and you should feel free at any time to email me and let me know what that is. I'm always eager to get your thoughts, your questions, and would be happy at any time to respond to those.
Roger,
Elliot?
one quick thing in that vein. We found the tools tremendously helpful. Once they've decided to do an acquisition, we basically have said to them, they fail because 80% of the time they only focus on the contracts and the revenue and the financial due diligence. And we've been able to walk through with a placemat and say, okay, here's everything else that you probably don't have the talent to do the integration that you need to think about. And what we'd like to do is we get to see both sides of the coin. They're out in chasing these acquisitions. Is there some way that we can use the tools for them to assess prior to making the decision how effective, beyond the contracts and the finance, the leadership that they may have, and use that in the same proactive fashion that happens once they make the acquisition?
Well, what I'm about to say won't surprise you or any of you, but as we think about it, for example, the easiest thing to do is to say to a management group, well, let's talk about the talent you have that you want to help you with this acquisition. And let's identify, and we can use the cards to do that if they're managers or they're in the executive group. Let's prioritize what we think their absolutely key skills are, and we can do a 3-bucket sort and take a look at where we think that talent is, and then look at our map and say, well, it looks like leader A and K and J have the kinds of things we're going to need in the first 3 steps, and 4 other leaders have the kinds of things we need in the next couple of steps. Now, of course, that takes time. Another way to do it, really, an easy way to do it would be to do 360, but just make it a 180 or a 90 to get a handle on the management group and to find out where their perceived strengths are, and to say to the team thinking about the acquisition, based on the data, here are the people who are going to be most useful for you at different parts of this process. So we all know that we can't all be outstanding in all things, and each and every member of our management team are going to have some strengths and some not so strengths that we're going to want to highlight and pay attention to, and utilize those strengths at the right time in the process of an acquisition or a merger. So we have the tools to get there. It just takes time and intentionality to use those tools in the most productive way.
And Roger, would I use those in the same way prior to the acquisition with the acquiring leadership team? You know, it's part of my due diligence.
Sure. I would encourage people to do that. if you don't have other data sets on them, do it. Because to say, you know what, we need to know where this talent is, and let's have a good understanding of that talent as we move forward. So that could be really useful. Well, I'm glad all of you attended, and please feel free to send along other questions. LM, is there any wrap-up piece you wanted to say here?
No, I just want to thank everybody for their time and appreciate you plugging in, and we will send the recording out as well. So thank you, Roger, a really important voice and one we rely on in this matter. So thank you very much.